Shalom everyone, hope everyone's doing well. B'ezrat Hashem. Today we're going to learn in Masechet Sanhedrin, Tetvav Morale 15a, and we are going to start the bottom of Yidalid Amud Bet, 14b at the bottom, at Ha'erachin Chulei. We're going to have two sections in today's learning. The first is really a continuum from yesterday, talking about the number of people required to appraise certain items that were sanctified, dedicated to hektish and similar type subjects. Specifically, we'll talk about erachin of items. We'll talk about lands and also people. And then this will bring us really to a similar discussion regarding hair that's meant to be cut if it's considered detached or attached. And then in the second section of the day, we'll actually move on to the next part of the Mishnah, which is talking about dinei nefashot, capital cases requiring courts of 23, specifically in regards to bestiality. We'll get to that, God willing, at the end of the day today. As always, our learning should be a zechut, a merit, as a refuah shlema, a speedy, full recovery for Yaakov ben Dinah, and we should only hear bisarot tovot, we should only hear good news. So we begin at the bottom of the page of Yidalid Amud Bet today, the second to last line, ha'erachin. Now, it's important to understand a little bit of a backstory here before we get into the Gemara today. We learned yesterday that when it comes to items that person sanctified, movable hektish items, so in order to assess its value, to deconsecrate it, you need a court of 3 people in order to appraise its value properly. So that's what we mentioned yesterday regarding hdeshot b'shlosha, right? That's the idea of hdeshot b'shlosha. So today we're moving on. We said in the Mishnah, ha'erachin ha'metaltalin. We said movable items of erachin also require a court of 3 to assess its value. Now the issue is inherent in the language here, because we know there is a parsha in the Torah of erachin. In the end of Bechukotai, we mentioned yesterday, there the Torah talks about how if somebody pledges the value of himself or of another person. So the Torah tells us that there's really 2 ways you could pledge your value. If you say my erech, I'm dedicating my erech to the Beit HaMikdash, so the Torah says specifically based on your gender and your age, there are numbers of money, a certain amount of money you have to give. It doesn't make a difference how healthy you are, how strong you are, how much of a slave you could be. It doesn't make a difference. That's where you say erki alai, or the erech of that person is on me to dedicate. Now if a person says demei alai, if a person says I dedicate my value, not my Torah value like we defined before, but rather just my value. So then we'll see later, we'll get into this actually, which is you have to give the value you would be as worth the slave in the slave market. And that would actually depend on many factors, including your health, your strength, all of those things would come into play. The problem is, the Mishnah says, in order to assess the value of erachin metaltalin, you need 3 people. The issue is, the word erachin or arachin is not applicable to metaltalin. Metaltalin means movable items. Arachin is applicable to pledging the value of a person, and then you have to know the Torah value. So what does the Mishnah mean when it says arachin and metaltalin require 3 people to assess? This is something that's a reference to dedicating people's value, not items' values, not movable items. So says the Gemara, my arachin and metaltalin, what is this case that you need 3 people to appraise? So we have 3 answers. Amar Rav Gidl, Amar Rav. Rav Gidl, Amar Rav is the first answer. But Omer, it's where he says, erech kli ze alai. What happened was, he said, I pledge the erech, the value of this vessel on me. Now that's really a very strange statement, or almost contradictory statement, because an item doesn't have an erech. The only things that have an erech is really people, as we explained. But Amar Rav Gidl Amar Rav, Rav Gidl Amar Rav explains in such a scenario where he uses a strange language of erech in reference to a kli, turning to Tetvav Mud Aleph, if somebody says this language, notein damav, he gives its value. My time, what's the reason? Because Adam yodea she'en erech lekli. A person knows erech is not a language applicable to a vessel. So obviously what he really means to do is to pledge the value of that vessel. And he meant to say, demei kli ze alai, I want to pledge the value of this in the normative language. Why did he say erech? Because he's a funny guy. Unclear why. But the point is, then we'll evaluate how much it's worth, because that's really what he meant to say, and then he will give its value. So the way that Rav Gidl Amarav, the first answer of the Gemara is that when it says in the Mishnah, Arachina mitaltalin, it means if somebody pledges the erech of a kli, what he really means to say is the demei, the value, the normal value of it, and then they'll assess with 3 people how much this is worth, and that's what he will have to give. Now, I just want to point something out before we continue. There is an interesting point that Rashi seems to hold here, which is in such a scenario, really one could argue, and I don't want to get too complicated or too into this, but it really ties into the question we'll get to after the third answer, is that if you pledge the value of an item, the item itself is not holy, you could argue, but the value needs to be dedicated to hektish, to Beit HaMikdash. But Rashi, his shita here seems to be that really what happens now is the item, you need to give the value for sure, but until you give the value, the item itself also takes on a consecrated-like status. Just want to point that out because it'll help us with the question we'll get to in a few minutes. So the Gemara says, wait a second, it's a beautiful answer, what the Mishnah means, but the problem is in the language of the Mishnah, it's still difficult because, arachina metaltalin, why does the Mishnah say arachin, the evaluations or the appraisals of metaltalin, of movables? Really it should say arachin shel metaltalin mibaile. The appropriate way to bring out this point would have been the estimation, arachin, the value of movables. That's really what should be said. The emphasis of our Mishnah, arachin metaltalin, it sounds like the evaluation is movable. So to say this pshat in the Mishnah, it doesn't really fit into the words. So the Gemara answers, Enechanami, Tani, the way you should explain in the Mishnah is, Arachin shel metaltalin. It means the estimation or the appraisal of metaltalin, of movable items, that is estimated through or appraised by 3 people. That's really what the Mishnah means to say. This is answer number 1. So again, Rav Gidl Amarav is the first explanation. It means if a person pledges the erech, the Torah value of a kli, what he means to say is the demei, the value, the normative value of the kli, and that's what you'll have to give to the Beit HaMikdash. Answer number 2. Rav Chizda Amar Avimai, Rav Chizda in the name of Avimai, b'matfis mitaltal erachin. So we have a scenario like this. This is the case of the Mishnah that requires 3 judges to evaluate its value. What is it? It's where a person pledged, in general, he pledged something to the Beit HaMikdash. For example, he said, Erki alai. He said, I will dedicate my erech to the Beit HaMikdash. And we assess how much that is. And then he said, matbis mitaltalin le'erachin. He said, I pledge the metaltalin, this car, to cover the payment for what I owe based on my pledge of erki alai. So really, the person over here dedicated a vessel, an item, to be used to pay off the erech that he previously dedicated of his own value, for example. And that's what you need the assessors, you need the appraisers to come to see, does the kli, the car, cover the value of what he owes or not? That's the pshat in the Mishnah. Problem is, again, the Mishnah's language is difficult in this pshat because, erachina metaltalin, why does the Mishnah say movable items or estimations that are movable? Really it should say metaltalin shel arachin mibaile. Again, really the Mishnah should say the movable items that are used to cover erachin. That's really the language that we're trying to say. Mibaile, that's what it should have said. So the Gemara is again tani metaltalin shel arachin. No problem. That's really what it means. Metaltalin shel arachin, the movable items used to cover the arachin. That's what the Mishnah means to say. So this is a second answer of Chizda's answer. He's saying is the person pledged an erech of another individual. He used this as a pledge to cover that money that he owes, and that's what the Mishnah means. You need 3 appraisers to determine the value of that item if it covers the money that he owes. Now Rabbi Avo comes, he says a third answer. Rabbi Avo Amar, he says, Ba'omer erki alai. What happened was, a person said, I'm pledging my value to the Beit HaMikdash. Okay? So now he owes, let's say he owes $10,000, but he doesn't pay up. So what happens now is the Kohen comes and he wants to seize some of this person's property to pay up the debt that that person owes. Ba Kohen ligvot bimenu. Now the Kohen comes to collect. Now, if he collects metaltalin, if he's collecting movable items to cover the erech this person has dedicated, so as the Mishnah says, bishlosha, you need 3 people to estimate the value of that metaltalin, that movable item, to make sure that it covers the money that he owes. Karkaot ba'asara, but as the Mishnah says, and we'll get to this momentarily, If he's claiming land, if the Kohen is collecting land for this erech that this fellow pledged, so then you'll need 10, which we'll see later actually. You need 9 plus a Kohen, total of 10 people to appraise, because that's a distinction between movables and land when it comes to the deconsecration or collections. So Rabbi Avo is the third pshat. He says it's when the Kohen is coming to collect because this fellow did not carry through on the erech that he was supposed to pledge, that he was supposed to pay. They'll collect, again, with 3 people appraising metaltalin, 10 people to appraise karka. Now Rabbi Achami Difti asks Ravina the following question. He says like this: I understand, according to the first 2 answers, why you need this appraisal to go on. You need such a situation because like this, there's a certain item here. Let's say the first answer, the first explanation we said is, he needs to give the full value of this item in order to remove its hektish status, otherwise it might remain hektish. Okay, that I understand. You need people to appraise it so that this item does not remain with a hektish status, because if it would, we know there's an isur of me'ilah. You're not allowed to benefit from something that's owned by hektish. There's actually a major isur called me'ilah, misappropriation of hektish. So according to that answer, I understand the necessity of appraisal. I get it. Similarly, in the second answer we said, which was Rav Chizda, it's where he dedicates the item to cover costs of the hektish that he had previously dedicated. Again, in a similar sense, he dedicated that item to hektish in order to evaluate if this indeed is going to be removed from hektish, this item, so that people can benefit from it after. You need an appraiser. But the kasha the Gemara asks in the third answer, Rabbi Avo said, if he said erki alai, means he dedicated his own erech to hektish. Now, you want to know if an item that the Kohen is about to collect forcibly is going to cover the costs of what it is or not. What's the big deal? Why do you need an appraiser? Let's say they make somewhat of a mistake and they undervalue it, right? The guy could cover the costs of it after. Nobody is going to end up benefiting from hektish inappropriately. So why is there a genuine requirement, according to the third answer, if there's no genuine issue of me'ilah that could come out of this? So let's see that inside. Amar le'Ravacham midifti l'Ravina. The first 2 answers where the appraisal goes on to remove something from its hektish status so people don't benefit from hektish inappropriately. I get the need for appraisers, 3 people, in order that people don't benefit from hektish ultimately. But if it's entering something into hektish, in this case where the Kohen comes to collect movables or land, lamali, why do I need 3 people? Let's say he makes some sort of a mistake. Anyways, the thing is now becoming hektish. Who cares? So he'll pay a little bit more after if it's necessary. So Amar Leis, Ravina said back, Svarahu, it's a logic. Mali iyule mali afuke. What is the difference if it's entering hektish or it's being removed of its hektish status? Afuke my time. What's the reason if it's being relieved of its hektish status? You need this appraisal. Dil matai, because maybe you'll make a mistake and it won't come out appropriate. Eyule nami dil matai. Maybe when it's entering hektish also you'll make a mistake, and therefore either way it would be important to have a proper appraisal so that there is no mistake that's made when there's 3 appraisers that come to evaluate it. Now, Rabbi Yehuda argued on the Tanakama. Rabbi Yehuda said that when it comes to deconsecrating movable hektish, or, as we said before, evaluating arachin, movable items, in the 3 examples we gave, you don't just need 3 appraisers to evaluate it, but you need 3, and one of them has to be a Kohen. Tanakama says you just need 3, you don't need 3 and 1 to be a Kohen. So Amar Rav Papa, Rabbi Yehuda Omer v'chulei. Fine. Amar Rav Papa l'Abai. Rav Papa says to Abai the following: Bishlam the Rav Yehuda, I understand according to Rav Yehuda, he requires one of these 3 to be a Kohen. I get it. Why? Hainu dichtiv Kohen, because the Torah says Kohen. It makes sense. It says Kohen in the parasha of deconsecration to emphasize one of them has to be a Kohen. El Rabbanan, but according to the other the Tanakama of our Mishnah, Kohen lamalahu. Well, why do you need a Kohen? It means according to the Rabbanan, you don't hold that you need a Kohen. So what is the Kohen in that parasha actually necessary to teach us? And the Gemara says, Kashya, this is indeed difficult. Meaning, it shouldn't be necessary to have a Kohen because it shouldn't be necessary to write Kohen in that parasha because ultimately they don't hold you need it. And the Gemara says, Kashya, this is indeed difficult. Now, like we mentioned before, when it says Kashya, it means this is difficult, but it doesn't refute the opinion. So in this context too, it's not tiyufta, like that would be a refutation, but rather it's just a Kashya. Okay. Sorry, give me 1 second here. Let's continue. Zat Hashem. Oh, we're all over the place today. All right, let's go ahead here, Chevra. Zat Hashem. We said in the Mishnah, according to the Rabbanan also, when it comes to appraising property, means if somebody dedicated property to Hektish and he wants to deconsecrate it, so we said there, 3 judges is not sufficient, like movables, but you need 10 appraisers to come, and one of those has to be a Kohen. So the Mishnah had told us, Karkaot tisha v'kohen. We said, when it comes to lands, to deconsecrate them, the appraisal needs to be done by 9 people plus 1 Kohen. Now we remember yesterday, we mentioned this. We said, there's actually 3 different parshiyot that talk about the appraisers needed in order to deconsecrate something. We have arachin, like we mentioned at the beginning of today. Then we have the redemption of animals or items that were sanctified. And then we have the deconsecration of karkaot, of lands. Now, it mentions the word Kohen 3 times in the first parsha, 3 times in the second, and 4 times in the last, which Shmuel taught us yesterday is the source, seemingly at least, that you need 10 appraisers in order to deconsecrate lands. We left off yesterday a little bit difficult, why you need only 3 for movables, but that's a different story. The kasha the Gemara is going to wonder is like this. If the source that 10 people are needed for the appraisal and to deconsecrate these items and property in this case is because it says Kohen 10 times, so then maybe you should need 10 Kohanim. Why is it that it says in the Mishnah 9 other regular Israelim, just 1 Kohen? It says Kohen 10 times, so you should indeed need 10 Kohanim to appraise the property that you're deconsecrating. So asks the Gemara, Karkaot tisha v'kohen, Menani mili, where do we know this from? Amar Shmuel, so Shmuel explains, Asara Kohanim ketuvin beparsha. It says 10 times the word Kohen in regards to deconsecrating those properties. And we say as follows, listen to this, a very interesting idea. Chad legufei. So 1 is required for itself. Means 1 is to say you need one of these 10 to be a Kohen in the deconsecration process. Hanoch, now the other 9 that remain have a mi'ut achar mi'ut. Those are considered an exclusionary term after an exclusionary term. And there's a rule in the Torah. Since it says mi'ut, meaning it says it specifically has to be Kohen, a particular terminology, which is exclusive. Ve'ein mi'ut achar mi'ut el l'rabot. So says Shmuel, once you have exclusionary term after exclusionary term, the rule is it's not exclusive anymore, but actually it flips the opposite. It's like double negative makes a positive. So in the context 2 here, once you already know one of them has to be Kohen, that's the first usage. But then every time it says Kohen following becomes a exclusive term following an exclusive term, which creates an inclusion, which means that it actually does not have to be Kohanim moving forward. Da'afilu tesha Yisraelim ve'achad Kohen, even if you had 9 Yisraelim and only 1 Kohen, that would also be sufficient. Let me just speak that out, what we just said. Very interesting chidush, the way Shmuel is learning. The fact that the Torah says Kohen the first time, one of the appraisers has to be a Kohen. But then it says Kohen again, which is an exclusion after an exclusion, which means it should be a Yisrael. The third time is also an exclusion after an exclusion, which means you need another Yisrael. Okay, go through it till the end. You're going to have 9 Yisraelim and 1 Kohen. Comes along the Gemara, and the Gemara says, but why are you calculating it like that? So Rav Huna, Breder of Natan, is going to ask the following question. I'll show you another way of calculating that would not come to the same conclusion, which is like this. Maybe the way you should look at it is as follows. First time it says Kohen means you need to have a Kohen. Right? That's specific. The second time, it's indeed an exclusion after an exclusion, and that would teach you need a Yisrael. But now you're not following the next time it says Kohen, the third time, an exclusion after an exclusion. Because the second time we actually said is a ribui, because the second time is an exclusion after the first exclusion. So now the third time it appears is indeed a new exclusion, which should say you actually need a Kohen as the third individual. And then the fourth time is an exclusion after an exclusion, which should say that you need a Yisrael, which means if you go through it this way, it would come out, you need 5 Kohanim and 5 Yisraelim. And then it would come out, this doesn't support the halacha of our Mishnah. So, Matkif la Rav Huna Breder of Natan, Chamisha Kohanim, Chamisha Yisraelim. Maybe you only should need 5 Kohanim and 5 Yisraelim. How do you know 5 Yisraelim and 1 Kohen? Kashya, the Gemara says this is indeed left difficult, unresolved. Let's continue. Now, in the Mishnah, we said, the final point about deconsecration, we said that Adam is kiyotze bahen. A person is the same as karka, that if a person seemingly is consecrated, to assess his value and deconsecrate, you need nine people and plus a kohen, which is 10 total people, to assess its value. The problem the Gemara has, and the way Tosafot explains, is that you can't consecrate a person. Now, you could actually consecrate, you could sanctify the body of an eved, of a servant, because servant is considered property. But the fact that the Mishnah uses the terminology Adam does not include avadim. So it sounds like you're consecrating a regular free person, but that's impossible because you cannot sanctify a person to hektish. So says the Gemara, Adam kiyotze bahen, Adam mi kadosh, is a person sanctified? Could you consecrate a person? So Rabbi Yavo says what the Mishnah means, but Omer demei alai. It's where a person dedicated the value of a person, not the person himself, but the value of a person. The Tanya, like the Braita says, Omer demei alai. If somebody says, I consecrate my value to hektish, shaminoto ke'eved animkar b'shuk. As we mentioned before, we evaluate him like a slave in the slave market. The eved itgash lekarkaot, and since slaves we find elsewhere in regards to Yerusha, inheritance, they are similar, they're compared to lands. So the same way sanctified land requires 10 people, so a sanctified person's value, who is like land, who is determined based on his slave value, would also require 10 people to appraise in order to determine how much money he has to dedicate to hektish. Now, Rabbi Avin asks a very interesting question based on this. What we're concluding here is that a person's body, in terms of its dedication to hektish, is like karka, is like land, and it requires 10 people to appraise its value so he knows how much money he has to give to hektish. Comes the Gemara, Rabbi Avin asks the following sheila, the following question. What happens if a person has hair, and that hair is ready to be cut off? Whatever the amount of time usually a person would get a haircut. I guess you have some people that they get a haircut once every 6 months. You have some people that are makbid every 2 weeks. But whatever the normal time to get a haircut is, if he has passed that time. So the question is as follows. Let's say a person sanctified his hair, the value of his hair. But that hair is ready to be cut off. Means it's beyond the time that people would normally continue to grow it out. Do we look at that hair as movable item? Because since it's ultimately ready to be cut off, so it's like detached from his body. And if it's movable consecrated items that need appraisal, we said you need 3 judges to evaluate. Or do we say, even though it's ready to be cut off, tachlis, it's still connected to his head, it's connected to his body? And if so, in order to estimate its value, you should need 10 people, because a person is compared to land, and therefore like land requires 10, a person should also require 10, and his hair should be the same, requiring 10 to estimate its value. Just on the side, hair has value. We know it could be used today. It's a big market in shaitels, in wigs. They used to use it also back in the day as strainers, different kinds of things. So that's the question. Do we look at this hair that's ready to be cut off as detached, and therefore it's like movables, which requires 3 to estimate its value for hektish? Or it's like attached, and therefore it's like karka, and does not require 3, it requires 10. So by Rabbi Avin, se'ar ha'omed ligzoz, if you have hair that is ready to be cut off, bekama, how many people are required to appraise its value? Kegazuz dami uvishlosha, do we look at it as it's detached already, and it requires 3, like dedicated things to hektish that are movable? Or do we look at it as attached still, and therefore you need a total of 10, like land, to appraise its value? So Tashma, the Gemara says, let's prove it from a Braita. The Braita in Masechet Gittin, this is brought, and it teaches us the following idea. Hamakdish es et avdo. If somebody sanctifies his eved, okay, he says, my eved is hektish. Ein mo'alin bo. So the Tanakama of the Braita says there's no me'ilah in that eved. Now this is a unique halacha. It does become dedicated to hektish, but the halacha is that there's an isur generally if you dedicate something to hektish of me'ilah. You're not allowed to misappropriate that, use that for your own benefit. However, that aveira and that transgression and punishment is not felt regarding something of karka, of land that's dedicated to hektish. It's still hektish, it's asur to benefit from it, but you will not be chayav like you'd be chayav for metaltalin. You're not over on the isur of me'ilah if you benefit from land. Now, since avadim are compared to land, it's the same thing. Ein mo'alin bo, you have not transgressed the isur me'ilah for the punishments that would come along with it, because an eved is not able to be like hektish, like movable, since it's dedicated, since it's compared to karka, land. Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel Omer, mo'alin b'saro. Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel says there is me'ilah in relation to its hair. V'kaimalan, and the Gemara says we have established in that Braita de b'saro made ligzos pligi, that the debate really is contingent on hair of the eved that was ready to be cut off, which means the Tanakama holds that even though it's ready to be cut off, it's still connected to the eved's head, and it's considered like karka, and there's no me'ilah when it comes to karka. And therefore, he would hold, the Tanakama of that Braita will hold, in the context of our case, in order to evaluate its value, you need 10 people, because it's like the eved, like the person himself. But Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel says that we look at it as detached already, and therefore there is me'ilah associated with its hair, because it's not considered connected to karka, and in our context too, since it's considered disconnected, it's considered metaltal, and that's been dedicated to hektish, and therefore you only need 3 people to evaluate its value. Shma mina, and that's a good proof that this is indeed subject to a machloket tanaim, if the hair that's ready to be cut off is considered detached or attached, in terms of appraisal of hektish as well. Says the Gemara, okay, so once you've established there is such a machloket, let's suggest that there's another machloket tanaim that's contingent on the same underlying debate. Titnan, the Mishnah in Bab Metzia tells us the following. Now this is regarding a halacha of modem miktzat. We know that the halacha is, there's really 3 shvuot, 3 vows that the Torah require on a biblical level. There's other ones that are rabbinically ordained, rabbinically required, but there's 3 that are midoraita. One of them is called Shvuat Modem Miktzat. Classic case of Shvuat Modem Miktzat is, I take someone to court and I say, I deposited by you $100. He says, I only accepted, I only had 50. It's not true, I didn't have 100. He has to swear based on his partial denial of my claim, and that's a Shvuah Deoraita, a Torah type of Shvuah. The Mishnah in Bab Metzia discusses a related case, and the case is as follows. There's one point to remember, which is Shvuat Modeh B'Miktzat is only enforced by movable items. But if there's a claim like this, the same case regarding land, there's no Shvuah. That's the halacha. So the Mishnah there above Metzia says, Rabbi Meir Omer, Rabbi Meir says, Yesh Dvarim Shehein Kekarka. There are things that are like land, which means that regarding Shvuah Modeh B'Miktzat, you should not theoretically have to make such a shvuah. Ve'enan kekarka, but it's not like karka, means you still do. Ve'ein chachamim modem lav, chachamim disagree and say that there would not be a shvuah because it's deemed entirely like karka. Kate said, what's the case? The case is like this. Eser kfanim toanot masarti lecha. Reuven claims, I gave Shimon 10 vines that were connected to the ground that were loaded up with grapes, right? So they're connected. And they were loaded up with grapes, as we'll see, that were ready to be harvested. Va'ala omer, and the other one claims, means the recipient in this case, the shomer, enan ela chamish. No, you only gave me 5. Now this is modeh b'miktzat. He's admitting partially, but they're still connected. That's the problem here. Rabbi Meir mechayev. Rabbi Meir says, even though it looks like land, we don't treat it like land, and therefore you're chayav shvuah modeh b'miktzat hatana. Chachamim disagree and they say, it's still attached to the ground and therefore it's like karka and there's no shvuah of modeh b'miktzat in this case. If Amar Rabbi Yossi Bar Chanina elaborated, he explained, what is this machloket ba'anavim ha'omdot li batzer askinan? We're talking about that the grapes are ready to be harvested. Mar Savar, Rabbi Meir holds, kibtzurot damyan, that since they're ready to be harvested, it's as if they were already detached, and therefore it's considered metaltalin, and this is a claim regarding a case of movables. That's why you have to make a shvua. Umar savar, but the chachamim hold lav kibtzurot damyan. We don't look at them as detached. It's considered karka. And regarding land, there's no concept of shvuat moed b'miktzat in land, and that's why you don't have to make a shvua. So says the Gemara, it would appear Rabbi Meir follows the position of Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel in the prior debate regarding if the hair is considered detached when it's ready to be cut or not. That Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel says it is considered detached. Similarly, Rabbi Meir reflects that position, and the Chachamim follow the Rabbanan in that previous Braita. So the Gemara refutes and says, "Lo, it's not necessarily the same debate." Afilo Tamer Rabbi Meir could even be like the Rabbanan, and that Shita would say the hair is considered connected. Why? Because Ad Kan Lo Ka'amar Rabbi Meir Hatam. Rabbi Meir only says over there in the case of Shua of Moed b'Miktzat, because Kol Kama Deshavka Lahu, if you leave the grapes on Mikchash Kechishi, if grapes are ready to be harvested and you leave them on, it gets worse because it starts to rot. So there Rabbi Meir will say it's like it's detached, and that's why you can make a Shvat Moed b'Miktzat in this case. Avol Saro, but regarding hair, Kol Kama Deshavka Lahu, right? As long as you leave it on, Ashbuche Mishbach, it actually gets better. The hair grows longer. It gets more luxurious. So therefore, maybe Rabbi Meir would say, even though regarding grapes, I'd say it's detached, and you make a shvuah of moed b'miktzat, regarding the hair, which is the question about the hektish, is there me'ilah? Rabbi Meir would say, perhaps I agree with the Rabbanan, there's no me'ilah in the hair, because so long as it gets better, it grows, it gets better, and therefore it's still considered connected. It's not considered disconnected. So therefore, even though I hold over here, it's considered disconnected in regards to the shvat moed b'miktzat, regarding the hair, I might say, like the Rabbanan, it is considered connected, and these machloktim, these two arguments are not necessarily contingent on the other. Okay, let's move on now to the second section of the day, and really we're moving on now to the second section of the Mishnah. Until now, we discussed the first section, which was all the cases of non-capital adjudication, which requires a court of 3. But now we're moving on to the second section, which discussed capital cases that require courts of 23, and particularly the one we discussed in the beginning of this section in the Mishnah was bestiality. So the Mishnah had told us that any case of bestiality, which means a person has relations with an animal, you need a court of 23 to adjudicate the status, to paskin in regards to the man and the animal, and they'll both be put to death. Again, assuming everything is proven guilty. So the words of the Mishnah were, Dinei nefashot be'esrim mishlosha, haroveya v'hanirva be'esrim mishlosha. It says roveya. Roveya means the man had relations. Roveya means, one second. Let me say this right. Yeah. Roveya in this context means if an animal has relations with a woman, so a male animal sodomizes a person, and nirva is an animal that is sodomized by a person, so the halacha is the man and the animal, or the person and the animal, are judged by a court of 23. Now the Gemara's medayik is that our Mishnah does not seem to differentiate between, let's get this clear, if a man has relations with an animal, so he has relations with an animal, or similarly, if a woman has relations with an animal, that's where she's the passive participant and the animal is what you call the active participant. Whereas if the man has relations with an animal, the man is active and the animal is passive. That's how it would go. But it does not differentiate in our Mishnah between those cases where a woman brings an animal upon herself, the animal is active, the woman is passive, or if a man brings an animal upon himself, that the animal has relations with him also. It sodomizes him. So the Gemara says, from this it would imply that there would be a judgment of 23, also not only if the animal sodomizes a woman, but also if it sodomizes a man. The problem is, the Gemara wonders, is what's the source for that? Because I know the source, as we're about to show, if a man has relations with an animal, man's active, animal's passive, or if a woman is passive, the animal has relations with her, the Psukim say that miforash, and we compare the woman and the animal, and the man and the animal, that they all need courts of 23. But we don't have a clear proof to necessarily, which we'll see today, is if an animal sodomizes a man, how do we know also that's adjudicated capitally, that requires a court of 23 for those participants to be put to death? So says the Gemara, kapasik vitani. It writes without differentiating. Loshna rova zachar, doesn't make a difference if the animal sodomizes a man, veloshna rova nekeva, nor if the animal sodomizes a woman. Meaning is that even if it sodomizes a man, the halacha would be you need a court of 23 to adjudicate this court case. 1 second. Roveya, it's roveya, sorry. Roveya zachar, roveya nekeva. Fine. So the Gemara says, Bishlam roveya nekeva dichtiv. I know the source, you need 23 when it comes to an animal that has relations with a woman, because it says, V'arakta et ha'isha ve'et ha'be'ema. It says you shall kill the woman and the animal, and we compare the woman to the animal, just as death for a woman would only be in a court of 23, same thing with the animal. That's where the woman is passive and the animal's active. El roveya zachar min nalan. But how do we know if the animal sodomizes a man, that he would also, in that case, also require a court of 23 to adjudicate? So the Gemara answers because it's based on an extra pasuk. Because the pasuk already tells us if a man sodomizes an animal, or an animal sodomizes a woman, that there is this necessity of a court of 23. But tichtiv, then there's an extra verse, and it says, Kol shochevim be'ema mot yumat. It says, anyone that sleeps with an animal, lies with an animal, will surely die. Now, it can't be talking about where a man is sodomizing the animal, because we already know that from a different verse. So Taneu inyan l'nishkav, it must be that the verse is discussing a case where the animal sodomizes the man. That would be the chidush. And yet, the Torah expresses this as if the man is the active participant. So it compares him being the passive, the recipient, to him being the active. To compare when he's passive to when he's active. Just as if he's active, him and the animal require a court of 23 to adjudicate. Similarly, if he's the passive participant, he and the animal require a court of 23 to adjudicate. It would be the same story. We're going to stop here at the bottom of Tetvav Amud Aleph. We'll continue on next week, God willing, this whole parasha about the 23, the capital cases. And in the meantime, wish everybody Shabbat Shalom. Have a wonderful week. We'll continue on with Tetvav Amud Bet next week. And in the meantime, Shabbat Shalom. All the best. Stay good.